Last week, I said it was my intention this Lent to reflect on what motivated Jesus. But it feels like a fool's errand. How can I surmise what was in the mind of Jesus? All we have to go on are stories told by his disciples and those who followed after them. Perhaps that reveals instead what my task should be. Discerning what motivated his followers, and so each of us, tasked as we are with continuing where he left off. And if we are honest, we have not always taken Jesus' motivation to heart, especially when it comes to the cross. In fact, as James Cone points out, we have used theories in theology to turn the cross from an instrument of oppression into a sign of salvation, focused on how Jesus' death brings some kind of heavenly redemption. Consider this image. I realize it is a crucifix of sorts, but not as you would usually see one. This is Jesus as a king. On one level, it points to a connection between the cross and God's reign. But this medieval image is not that far removed from imperial images of a majestic Jesus made after the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. Often said in the upper portion of an apse where government leaders had once sat. These images reinforce the new alliance between church and empire. Once persecuted Christians now sat in positions of power. That may account for the king imagery more than any kind of hope for God's saving reign of justice. And so it makes me wonder if Jesus would have wept over a newly Christian Rome as he had once wept over Jerusalem. I suspect he would have if our gospel reading is anything to go by. Are church leaders in imperial appointments any different from a high priest named as such by a Roman governor? And that was the situation in Jerusalem when Jesus went into the temple courtyard and drove out the livestock, angrily decrying how they had turned it into a marketplace. As we heard, the disciples recall the line in Psalm 69, how he was filled with zeal for God's house. But I wonder, was he concerned about the temple? Or was it the house of Israel, the people? For Jesus' love of God and love of neighbor were two sides of one coin. As Cornell West says, justice is what love looks like in public. What Jesus saw in the temple was an injustice. It was necessary to exchange coins to pay the temple tax and to buy animals for sacrifice because Roman coins had an image of the emperor considered to be a god. But priestly elites made a handsome profit on this exchange, taking money from people already struggling under Roman taxation. Can devotion to God be coupled with such an injustice against one's neighbors? In Jesus' mind, it can't. Jesus' zeal for God's house was expressed in his zeal for justice, a commitment which led him to the cross. We see this most clearly in the Synoptic Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus' cleansing of the temple takes place at the end of his ministry, not at the start. If we are attentive, his whole ministry is about this in word and in deed, justice being the primary point of his parables. Again and again, him saying that in God's reign, the first will be last, and the last will be first. He invited his listeners to see the world other than the oppressive status quo. He didn't just upend tables in the temple. He upended expectations of who God is. He upended expectations of who we are to be, not just spiritually, but socially and politically. Hence, this image. It's from about 200 CE. It's one of the earliest depictions of the cross, but not as a devotional image. It is graffiti, a graffito mocking a Christian named Alexamenos. Jesus is shown with a donkey head. Why? Because donkeys were believed to be stupid. Up until this time, donkeys did not figure much in the stories of Jesus, just in his welcome into Jerusalem. But after this image, suddenly donkeys become a popular part of folklore about Jesus, especially the journey into Egypt where the family is fleeing the rage of an imperial appointment, King Herod. We embraced the donkey because we embraced how foolish the Christian message appears. As Paul writes, the cross is a scandal. How could we honor one who died so shamefully? We did it because we honor the vision of the world that Jesus died for. It's why his followers took his radical love, which was about including sinners at the table, and in which we heard last week how he forgave his executioners from the cross. They extended that radical love and formed just communities of compassion and care, where they shared property in common, where they looked after the vulnerable, affirmed women in leadership, called Jews and Gentiles slaves and citizens into equal fellowship. And this is the community that people were drawn to. So many people drawn to this community despite the fact they were being persecuted. They were living out a new social and moral contract. They were taking seriously the full meaning of God's reign. And they could do so knowing that the cross had not ended the movement as the Roman leaders had hoped. Because the crucified one, the one who died out of zeal for the people, he lived. And this is the Jesus we need to keep on proclaiming, to hold up his cross aware that it's more than a spiritual symbol. It's a reminder of how deep our commitment to justice must be. We too are called to be consumed with zeal for all of God's people, doing so in honor of Jesus' life as well as his death. We must, if we are to right the wrong caused by so many being seduced by the Emperor Constantine's conversion. In The Cross and the Lynching Tree, James Cone highlights how the opposite happened in Christian history, how it was Christians who were converted back to empire. He names how the lynching era is a chilling example of just such an empire conversion. Between 1880 and 1940, white Christians lynched nearly 5,000 Black men and women in a manner with obvious echoes of the Roman crucifixion of Jesus. Yet these Christians did not see the contradiction in these actions. It's because Christians in seats of power had turned the true meaning of the cross around They turned it on its head and reaffirmed the status quo. And if we're honest, that's still our situation around the world and in our own backyard. We want the cross to be a sign of heavenly access, but it is only in as much as it calls us to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, as it calls us to embody justice, as it calls us to honor God by honoring absolutely every single neighbor. So friends, may we reclaim the cross not in spite of the scandal, but because of it. Jesus' agenda may look like a fool's errand to a status quo world, but we know it is the path that leads to fullness of life for all. And that is a vision of the world worth dying for. Amen.